Hey everybody, and welcome to the first video in a long series of videos where we'll be looking at the Browning Auto 5, as well as the designs that the Browning Auto 5 sort of inspired, or designs that borrowed something from it, design-wise or conceptually, and sort of investigate the overall impact that the Browning Auto 5 has had. There are some certain gun designs that change a little bit whenever they release, right? Influential gun designs. There's some gun designs, though, that even after their initial impact, so many designs are based on them, based around them, borrow one or two or more things from them, to the point where, the thing itself ends up having a family of like 20 distinct models, more or less based on it. And through these series of videos, I'm hoping to do that for the Browning Auto 5 itself. Now, before we end up jumping into understanding a little bit more about the Auto 5 itself, I do want to get out of the way up front a discussion about what this series is and what the series isn't. This series will not be a detail stripping tutorial for these guns. I may make this later for the various guns. As of time of filming, for all of the guns that I plan on discussing on this, I have detail stripped them already. I know how difficult or not difficult it is for them. But some of these guns take 2.5 hours to detail strip, and that's just not going to be that accessible of a video. And I want to keep this initial series sort of high level, accessible, not too into the nitty-gritty details, more about the guns than about any particular tutorial as far as disassembling them, because really that's the biggest benefit of detail stripping videos, if you ask me. Additionally, while we will talk a little bit about history, especially where it's germane, this is not going to be a detailed historical analysis and retelling of the story of the Auto 5, nor any of the other guns we'll talk about. I have done my best to get the usual gun books for these guns where available, dug through tons of blogs to understand for some of these shotguns, right, there's not books about them, and you're just sort of, you're dependent on people who were there whenever the things happen to sort of tell the stories. And while I've done my best to read myself up on those, for some of these guns there's just not a lot of that information available. All this to say, for the deeper historical understanding of these sorts of things, right, that's sort of what you have CN Arsenal for. Matthias is an excellent resource for these sorts of things, and he researches his videos deeply to get the history right. I just don't know that for some of these things there is enough history, and I want the focus to be not so much on the history, although the history is interesting, and I'll include parts of it as I feel appropriate, but more about sort of the mechanics of the gun and how the individual components of the design show up in other designs and how things were changed one gun to the next. Of course, starting out here with the Auto 5, we can't do a whole lot of that. So this video is going to be very prefatory, very background information, and perhaps a little bit more in depth than some of the other videos, because other guns may borrow only one or two things from the Auto 5, and so we'll only talk about one or two things in great detail as far as comparison's sake, whereas on this video I'll need to talk about most of the core components of the gun, because pretty much all the different core components of the gun here end up being borrowed by another design later down the road. Additionally, one more thing this series isn't, is it's not going to be a step-by-step comprehensive guide on the minute model changes of guns like the Auto 5 or any of the other designs. Because of course, there's at least 6 distinct versions of safeties that show up on Auto 5s. I am not going to talk about 6 different versions of safeties, and I don't have examples of 6 different versions of safeties. So I think I've got 4 or 5 at this point. I'm getting close. But I'm not going to be that fine-toothed comb about it. Maybe in the future I could do that sort of a video, but generally the sort of collector's guide information is what I would refer to that as. That sort of information I'm going to try and leave out here because that is extremely nitty-gritty, fine-tooth comb, outside of the realm of the sort of high-level discussion that I'd like to have. As a part of trying to keep it relatively high level, I do want to include shooting section. So I may splice in shooting footage on some videos as appropriate to maybe show something better that I'm talking about that's best to see with the gun actually working. And so there will be shooting sections, and I will be giving my sort of opinion about how the guns shoot. And note that that will be opinion matter stuff because it's my opinion, and the way a gun fits me, or the way I shoot a gun, or the way the gun functions in my hands will be partially to blame on me as it comes to criticisms or praise that I have to heap on a particular gun. Before we get too far into things, I do want to give a little bit of background history on the Auto 5. Of course, like mentioned, this won't be a very deep dive on the history, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights before we start tearing into the gun. Now, the Auto 5 was designed a long time ago, at a time when black powder shotgun shells were fairly common. Smokeless powder shells were sort of the de facto standard. Most everything was proof tested with smokeless loads by the time the Auto 5 was on store shelves, but at the time of its development, black powder rounds were still a reality for shotguns. Additionally, this is the case today, but was certainly the case then. There is a wide variety of performance that you can get out of a 12-gauge shotgun. Everything from some fairly anemic, light trap loads up to some extremely powerful, bird hunting loads. And the concept for an auto-loading shotgun should allow for you to shoot reliably those really weak loads and those really heavy loads. And this is something that John Moses Browning, the designer of the Auto 5, was fully aware of. He was a shotgun enthusiast of sorts, and his concept for the Auto 5 was that it would be a very handy gun for trap or skeet shooting, and wanted to design an automatic shotgun around that. Now, when I say automatic, what I'm referring to is automatic loading. The term at the time, automatic, really only referred, in the civilian sense especially, to automatic loading. It didn't refer to automatic firing as in what machine guns do. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind, because I will refer to these as automatic shotguns repeatedly. Don't think that I'm saying these are machine guns. I'm not. I'm saying they're automatic shotguns, because the auto in Browning Auto 5 refers to automatic, and it's important to understand that's automatic loading, not automatic firing. They are semi-automatic shotguns. The semi part is automatic loading. Full automatic would be automatic loading and automatic firing. I want to get that terminology hiccup out of the way because I know some people end up having a little bit of a problem with it, but there that is. So John Moses Browning wanted to set out to design an automatic shotgun. It would effectively be the first of its kind. There were prototypes of this idea that had existed. It's unclear whether or not Browning had actually seen any of these prototypes, but he had certainly already dabbled in automatic firearms in general, so this wasn't to be anything completely revolutionary from a standpoint of there had been automatic firearms that had been figured out or conceptualized, but an automatic shotgun was sort of a very, very revolutionary concept because of that sort of difference in power. That difference in power that you're going to have the gun reliably work with is something fairly novel. So Browning designed a couple of very, very novel systems into the Auto 5 to sort of help with this. We'll end up discussing those systems in more detail later, but on the question of novel designs that Browning put into a shotgun, Browning's history as a designer, as an inventor, was sort of mired with a lot of patent work. As he was designing things, he would patent them. Typically, it would be Winchester's lawyers, Winchester's legal people, who was helping him with patent work as he went along. Browning worked very, very closely with Winchester for much of his early career. He would typically design things, work closely with Winchester's manufacturing people, figure out designs as they evolved and developed. The patents would be made in Browning's name, and then Browning would assign those patents, sell or license those patents, but he would do it outright to Winchester, so Winchester owns it for a lump sum. Come the Auto 5, Browning and Winchester had still been working together. Browning gets it in his head that the Auto 5 is really going to be the one. It's going to be the one that's going to get him set up for life, going to make a lot of money on it, and so this can't be one that he just sells for a lump sum. He decides he needs a royalty, and that's something that Winchester's just going to have to agree to. He springs this on Winchester, asks for royalty, and Winchester tells him that's not going to happen. Browning, realizing that he had a winner on his hands, goes, okay, and he sort of ceases his relationship with Winchester. This was probably Winchester's biggest mistake of all time, an absolute blunder. Browning goes and shops the design to Remington next to see if Remington would buy it. While he's waiting to meet with Remington's president, while he's there in the building, Remington's president has a heart attack and dies. That sort of complicates meeting with the guy, but Browning then goes and takes the gun overseas to FN, Fabrique Nationale in Belgium. FN had dealt with Browning before. They had manufactured some semi-auto pistols, some early pistols for Browning, and Browning felt like they would be a decent fit for the Auto 5. He shows it to them. They say that they like the idea, willing to give him a royalty, and sort of the rest at that point becomes history. Throughout FN's history, they end up manufacturing a lot of Auto 5s. Browning imports them here to the US, sells them here. FN also sells Auto 5s in Europe. It's not as popular in Europe as it was in the United States, In the United States, it ended up selling like wildfire. Took it a decade or two to really catch on in terms of sales numbers, but at that point, there was no stopping it. We had previously alluded to patents involved with the Auto 5, and while there was more than one patent involved with the Auto 5's design itself, sort of the most interesting one is the patent for the charging handle. It sort of seems strange, especially if you understand how patents work, a little bit of patent law. It's interesting to think that there was a time where you could patent a handle on the side of a gun to pull back a bolt, and that wasn't something that was going to be thrown out for obviousness. These days, not only is it obviously prior art, but I would like to think that that's a fairly obvious thing, but at the time that the Auto 5 was designed, that really was a foreign concept, having a handle on the side of a bolt to pull back the bolt with. It's sort of a funky relic of exactly how old the Auto 5 is. Now, one other company, whose gun we will end up touching on in a later video, did have to get around the fact that the Auto 5's charging handle was patented. They wanted to make an autoloading shotgun, but they couldn't have a charging handle on it. They got around that in an interesting way, and we'll end up touching on that gun in sufficient detail in a different video. For now, we'll turn back to the Auto 5 and just roughly go over the fact that it was manufactured in Belgium for much of its history. Eventually, production was moved to Japan. People will allude or point to the Auto 5 guns that were made in Japan being of a worse quality. I don't really think this is the case. I think it's sort of a pent-up resentment towards the Japanese for what they had done before and during World War II. However, the Auto 5 was manufactured in Japan for sort of the rest of its production and into and through its sunset years. Eventually, what led to the Auto 5's sunset, right, is that gas-operated shotguns, A, got cheap, and B, got good. Gas-operated shotguns were figured out in the mid-1950s, but they weren't very good, and they also weren't very cheap. By the time gas-operated shotguns got cheaper than the Auto 5, and also got more reliable, or at least lighter weight than the Auto 5, they ended up doing all the things the Auto 5 did, but cheaper. The Auto 5's time was pretty much up. Browning was certainly ready to move on to greener pastures, to newer designs, and you also sort of run into a momentum problem where eventually people want the new gun, right? They don't want the gun that's been made more or less the same for 100 years. And so the Auto 5 was on its way out and did end up leaving production. You can still find them today used, and in fact, Gunbroker puts out analytics on what's the most popular gun sold on the website. Auto 5s are the most popular shotgun to be sold, and they haven't been manufactured for like 20, 30 years at this point. I think that's sort of really a testament to A, how many of these guns there are, and then B, the fact that they really are a fantastic, fantastic shotgun. So, without having to touch on much more history, I think we're about ready to start looking at our two examples we've got here. Our gun on top is a 1953, if I remember correctly, manufacturer standard gun. The Auto 5 was offered in a variety of configurations. I won't go into too much detail about what those configurations really entail, but at a very high level you had your standard 12-gauge gun, a light 12-gauge gun, a magnum 12-gauge gun, a super lightweight 12-gauge gun. Then you had these permutations that existed in 20-gauge. You had your standard 20, your light 20, your mag 20, your super light 20. There was also 16-gauge guns. I believe there were super lightweight 16-gauge guns, but they were very, very rare. There was standard weight 16s, lightweight 16s, which were initially just called lightweight 16s, but then ended up being called Sweet 16, which was just a marketing term for the light 16. No such thing as a Magnum 16-gauge, though, so far as I'm aware. Anyway, so far as I've read. However, with these guns, it is common to get proven wrong, and even stuff that are in the collector books, you'll get wrong. So far as I'm aware, with the Auto 5 specifically, there wasn't 410 or 28-gauge guns that were made. However, with some of the subsequent designs, there were 28 and 410 versions. And again, I wouldn't put it past a 28 or 410 prototype of the Auto 5 existing, but I'm not aware of any serial production sold to the public sort of thing going on there. So there's certainly a wide variety of models of the Auto 5, and as we sort of touched on, we're not going to go through one by one for each particular model, but just to give you an idea of what we have here, on top we have a standard 12-gauge gun, and on bottom we have a super lightweight 12-gauge. What super lightweight really designates with an Auto 5 is an aluminum receiver and an aluminum trigger guard. In the US, this was typically a special order thing. They didn't offer the aluminum receiver on store shelves in the US. It was one of those you had to know it was something Browning was making and then FN was making, and ask Browning to import one from FN for you. And in fact, on the other side of this gun, you'll note that it doesn't say Browning anywhere. It's just it's like an FN Auto 5 or an FN automatic shotgun, because it was not, this particular gun was not intended to be sold in the US market and was actually imported well after the fact. You'll find interesting combinations of these guns sometimes where it's a steel receiver with an aluminum trigger guard, which, as best I can tell from researching, sort of denotes a special order sort of a thing going on. All that to say that I find the super lightweight guns to be extremely nice to shoot. You end up saving about a pound of weight compared to the steel gun, at least a standard weight steel gun. And it sort of just improves the balance overall of the gun, if you ask me. Now, again, the super lightweight guns are fairly uncommon, and a light 12 with a steel receiver gets you most of that bang for a lot less buck. So these are our two guinea pigs, just to give you guys some basic familiarity with what we're talking about here. I'll end up using this one to sort of take apart and show off, but again, under the hood, effectively the same guns we've got going on here. We'll take our earlier gun out of the way in a second, but I do want to highlight sort of the biggest change to the Auto 5's design is in the mid-50s, Val Browning, one of John Browning's sons, came up with a system for the Auto 5 that made it so that loading the shotgun becomes easier. On the initial Auto 5s, the way you have to load them is, whenever the bolt's forward, of course, you have your loading gate here. You can't push the loading gate in until you push the button, the bolt release, on the side of the receiver. That allows you to push the loading gate up and put a shell in. Sort of tricky to show off one-handed here, but like so, loads you around. After Val Browning had his way with the Auto 5, this part ended up being changed into a two-piece system, such that you didn't have to push the button on the side of the gun. This part in particular, that tenders the shells up from the magazine into the path of the bolt so that the bolt can close them into the chamber, is technically called the carrier. I tend to call it the lifter because it lifts shells up, but carrier is technically the correct term. You can find these two-piece carriers for sale, and they do retrofit back into the guns. Val Browning truly designed a very excellent system here, and compared to sort of your other shotguns that you run across, right, your these days Berettas and Benellis and these sorts of things, sort of the big advantage to the Browning system is you can throw shells into the gun as much as you want when the bolt's open, but as soon as you jack the bolt back, it's automatically feeding that round onto the lifter. Like so. This is an advantage, at least from a standpoint of, unloading this gun is intuitive. You just keep jacking the bolt and it will keep feeding rounds out of the gun until it's empty, just by hand cycling it. There's no like a Beretta button that you'll see on some Berettas that you have to push right there to manually feed a round out of the gun. And that's sort of the benefit there of that Browning system. This will sometimes be referred to as the Browning speed loader, this two-piece lifter. This is because if we take a shell with the action open, push that shell into the magazine tube and then release it, it will automatically chamber that round. Thus, Browning speed load. This was something that Val Browning ended up having a series of patents for, and that's sort of why you don't see it in a lot of other guns, but certainly by the 90s there are Benellis and Berettas that are modified to have a system that works similar to this, because A, it's freaking cool, and B, it is actually very convenient, because for loading shotguns fast, before the days of quad loading shotguns like you do for competitions, loading shotguns fast, it's very convenient if just with what you only need one motion, right? And with the Browning speed load system, you're only ever just putting shells in the bottom of the gun, and that gets it all the way full and chambered and ready to fire. Pretty nifty system. So, this gun will be our guinea pig. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about before we start taking it apart. Chief among them is just the overall appearance of the Auto 5. Of course, not all of them look exactly like this, but the humpback shape of the receiver is something that I do want to talk about. I personally find the humpback shape of the receiver to be cool and very based. However, if you were in the 1920s, you would complain about the shape of the humpback receiver. Practically everybody complained about the shape of the humpback receiver. The complaints was usually one of two things. It was that it obstructs too much of your field of view, which is kind of nonsense, because if you think about how other shotguns are designed, it's just rounded out here, and is just as much of your field of view is actually blocked. There's actually no difference in the field of view blockage. And some people would point to the fact that with the sun coming from behind you, you'd get glint off the sharp edge on the rear of the receiver, and that would obstruct your sight picture. I have had this happen. That is absolutely true. However, the number of times that you'll have the sun perfectly behind you to cause that problem is exceptionally rare. And some versions of Auto 5 will actually have sort of engraving right around that area, which is there specifically to break up glint, to sort of stop that mirage from happening. So that was one big complaint about the Auto 5, and in looking in other versions of the guns, we will note that this complaint that a lot of people made was taken very seriously by some manufacturers. Browning even actually looked at what it would take to overhaul the Auto 5's appearance to sort of hide the hump. They did not end up going through with this, but there were concept guns that they had looked at, and I think that's fairly interesting. Okay, I think with that preface out of the way, we're ready to begin taking some of the gun apart to understand a little bit more about how it works. Field stripping the Auto 5 is pretty simple. You'll go ahead, pull the bolt back, and then we will push the barrel back into the action slightly and unscrew the cap on the magazine tube. It'd be difficult to show this to the camera, but pull that back, unscrew the cap, and the handguard will come off, and the barrel will come off. We have an action, we have a barrel, we have a handguard. The handguard is really the worst designed part of the Auto 5, in my opinion, and I don't think this is something that you get to have a different opinion about. The big flaw in the Auto 5's design is that this handguard is a structural member. The thing that holds the barrel on the gun is the handguard. This wouldn't be as big of a problem, except for the fact that the Browning 5 is a long recoil shotgun. The barrel reciprocates all the way back into the action when the gun fires, and then the barrel comes back forward on this honking big spring until it smacks into the handguard. Just to sort of mock that up for you, this ring on the barrel is what interfaces with the handguard, and of course our handguard is here. Once the gun fires, the barrel comes forward and smacks into the handguard. Now, the gun has a system to keep the handguard from getting damaged whenever the gun barrel bottoms out against it. However, on very high round count Auto 5s, you'll end up having handguards where the wood actually compresses, and it lets the barrel come too far forward, and you'll end up having to make, or have someone else make, a shim that goes on the gun. I've had success 3D printing these shims, as well as getting laser cut brass shims, and they hold up great and sort of reverse that compression in the wood to keep your handguard working a little bit longer. The handguard on Auto 5s is just fragile. Pinching right here can crack them, dropping them can crack them, shooting them with the gun configured wrong, and we'll talk about configuring Auto 5s here in a second, shooting them with the gun configured wrong can lead to them getting cracked. So they are fragile. They're really the linchpin of this design. You'll see some people who ended up making aluminum handguards for their Auto 5s because that, that is going to sort of have superior mechanical properties to a dead tree. But I digress. Really, that's the worst part of the Auto 5's design is there in the handguard. And various companies, various different versions of the Auto 5, subsequent Auto 5 designs, will take different approaches to sort of deal with the handguard issue. Generally, that will come in the form of reinforcing the handguard one way or another. Turning to our barrel here, typically the barrel on the Auto 5, well, typically, it's going to be made of two pieces. You've got a barrel extension back here, and out front you have the barrel that's threaded into it, sort of familiar to most people these days. You have a hole in the top of the extension on the barrel that the bolt will lock into, because of course this is a locked breech system. And you have an ejector that's riveted to the barrel. Some Auto 5s will have this ejector riveted on a sliding pin so that the ejector can slide back and forth. Now, those sliding extractors are there sort of to help facilitate the use of 3-inch and 2.5-inch shells in guns so equipped to handle them. And that's sort of what's going on there. Most of them, though, are these solid riveted in place types. That's pretty much all we've got going on with the barrel. Of course, there'd be different options throughout the Auto 5's history for different ribs. You could have a vented rib like this. There's also solid rib guns where there's not these gaps in the rib, as well as ribless guns, as we saw on that earlier, that standard 12 gun. But that's about what we've got for the barrel here. I guess I do want to note that the barrel has a pair of rail notches on the extension, and that helps guide it as it goes in and out of the receiver as it reciprocates. Next up, we have our receiver in action. We won't actually take the gun down much further than this for the sake of this video. Of course, the stock comes off, which ends up letting you get the action spring out and lets you get the trigger guard off, and then lets you get the bolt out of the gun. It's a seriously involved process, and probably the other, if the humpback wasn't the biggest criticism of the Auto 5, the second biggest criticism, let's say, would be the difficulty of disassembly. There's a lot of screws on this gun. There's 2 here, and 2 here, and 2 there, and 2 there, and 2 there, and all of those screws have to come out if you want to get the bolt out of the gun. Additionally, there's a taper pin that tends to be very, very tight that has to come out to get the bolt out of the gun. Needless to say, this is not a gun that's quick or easy to take apart for sort of in-depth cleaning, right? Because there's moving parts of the gun that don't want to come out of there. But sort of the artifact of the antiquity of the Auto 5 is the fact that A, it uses a lot of screws to hold it together, and B, you got to take those screws out if you want to be able to really, really clean your gun. Of course, this one, I've already taken care of that on, and haven't shot this gun very much, so it's certainly not in need of another cleaning. But as a background information thing, that is one very legitimate complaint against the Auto 5. And because Auto 5s tend to be so difficult to clean, a lot of people just don't do it. There's been several Auto 5s, and in fact, also the variants of the Auto 5, but even specifically on Auto 5s, guns that I have that are over 100 years old, where you can tell that they were never taken apart, because there's some pins that end up being marred or screws that ended up having, not marred, but there's an indication that they've been removed. And I've had guns that I've taken apart where, I mean, if I'm not the first person to take it apart, I'm the first one to take it apart in 100 years, right? It hasn't been taken apart to be cleaned in a very long time. So you will run into this as a buyer, as a shopper of and for Auto 5s. You will run into guns that haven't been cleaned in a long time. And I tend to recommend, especially if you're having problems with the gun, the first place to start is probably to clean it. When it comes to Auto 5s, I do want to specifically point out that you should not just find a screwdriver that seems like it fits these screws and start trying to take them out. These screws require gunsmith-specific screwdrivers. Most screwdrivers actually have an angle. These flat blade screwdrivers are not actually flat, they're tapered. If you use a taper bit screwdriver on these screws, you will booger them up and they will look terrible, and I will hate you. I'll find where you live. It's not that hard. And I'll just take your gun back from you. It'll be like the people who rescue dogs that have been abused. I'm doing that with your gun. So please just buy the right screwdrivers. You can find them on Brownells, on Midway USA, on all these sorts of websites. And instead of being ground at a taper, they're ground completely parallel. So they engage all the way in the slot of these screws and prevent you from destroying the screws when you're trying to take them out. Please buy the screwdriver and stop making me buy Auto 5s that have jacked up screws. Thank you. It's been a public service announcement. Important thing to pay attention to there. Now, again, you should, of course, if you get an Auto 5, as I was saying, clean it if you're having problems with it. A lot of issues Auto 5s and the derivatives will have is simply because the gun is 100 years old, 60 years old, whatever, and has never been cleaned. Of course, one advantage of the long recoil system is the fact that there's no gas system that's bleeding gas back under the handguard or back into the action. And the action doesn't actually open until it's reciprocated all the way back. And by that time, lots of gas is vented out of the barrel. So it does tend to be a very clean action compared to pretty much any of the other stuff you'd run into, because gas-operated Berettas even extract early enough that you'll sometimes get a little bit of fire from the ejection port, or embers from the ejection port. That's not going to be happening with a long recoil gun unless you're using like really wacky gunpowders. So, because, it being long recoil has that sort of added factor of cleanliness and safety that really isn't present on guns that don't have such a slow cycle. Anyway, that's sort of my rant there as far as cleaning the gun. Now, one other thing that I really want to touch on here is the friction ring system on the Auto 5. And this is really, really novel. And it's something that I think, it's hard to rank, right? Browning's most impressive inventions. But for me, I think this might be the one. This is the system I alluded to multiple times earlier that Browning came up with to help the gun deal with the wide swath of loads that you may be putting through a shotgun. This system is comprised of a pair of rings, one ring here, and this ring has a steel tensioning band that goes around the outside of it. These rings sit on the magazine tube, and of course you have a spring here, and really all this spring does is it's the spring that holds the barrel forward and resists the reciprocation of the barrel bolt assembly whenever a round is fired. How specifically this ring system works, though, is very interesting. You'll note that there is a taper on the front end of this ring, and you'll note that on this ring there's a taper on the inside of it. Now, whenever this gun fires, this ring will actually be nested with the barrel. The barrel is going to be pushing backwards, and this ring is going to be supported by the recoil spring. Because the recoil spring is pushing the ring forwards, as it were, let me adjust this steel ring really quick just to make this more clear. There we go, get the gaps lined up. Because this ring is being pushed forward by the spring and the barrel is trying to push backwards, I'll sort of simulate what that's like by pushing forwards on this ring. Maybe a little tricky to see on the camera, but you should be able to see that that gap in the ring closes up. Might be a little bit easier to see if I push like this. There you go. Get a little bit more force on it. You'll see that the gap in the ring closes. And again, that's because the barrel is pushing the ring against the spring, and then between the spring and the barrel, the ring gets collapsed. When this ring collapses, it's going to pinch the magazine tube pretty darn tight. And the magazine tube is a rather thick-walled piece of steel, so it's not going to damage the magazine tube at all, but this ring is going to get pinched tight. When it gets pinched tight, it's going to resist moving, because that drastically ramps up how much friction there is. This is known as the friction ring system. If you own an Auto 5, you've probably heard about these friction rings before. They're very simple to understand once you know what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. So the chamfer on the front end of this ring with an Auto 5 is always going to go against the chamfer on the barrel. This ring is sort of there. I call it a control ring. I believe the official part name for this is the friction ring, and this is the friction piece and the tension band. However, this is the ring that actually provides friction. It should be the friction ring. This ring is like a control ring or an option ring, because there's two ways to sort of set this ring up. The first way is with the chamfer on the ring facing the back side of our friction ring. Now, both sides of this ring are going to be compressed whenever the gun fires, right? Because you've got a pair of chamfers now working against this ring. It's really going to collapse it down tight onto that magazine tube. However, you can also set this ring back against the receiver, like so. And now you've just got, on this end of the friction ring, you just have the recoil spring working against it. So now when the barrel tries to reciprocate, it's really just going to be the front side of the friction piece getting pinched. This substantially changes how much braking force, how much friction you get out of the ring itself. Now, I've put these guns on a scale before to try and get numbers for how effective the friction ring system is, and it'll differ pretty substantially, maybe like a 20, 30, 40% difference from one gun to the next. So it's not always going to be exactly the same, and certainly the freshness, the newness of the recoil spring, the actual diameter of the magazine tube, and how worn out the brass ring here is going to affect all of that. But from the numbers I pulled, in order to get the barrel assembly to start moving with things set up for maximum friction, which is the ring set up this way, with things set up for maximum friction, on this particular gun anyway, it's just shy of 70 pounds of force that this little ring gets you. It takes 70 pounds of force on the barrel of the gun to get it to move initially, when things are set up here for heavy loads. And of course that does count the force of the action spring as well. But 70 pounds of force to set things in motion, it's pretty substantial. It's a decent value. With the ring set up the other way, I was getting around 50 pounds of force required in order to get things to start moving. Those are pretty decent numbers. Some other Auto 5s that I've done this test with, the ring set up one way versus the other, I'm getting 50 pounds with the ring set up for max braking and maybe 35 set up the other way. Somewhere in there in that ballpark. I had one night where I just sat there and tested all the different guns and measured it just because I was so curious. But certainly the friction braking system provides a pretty substantial amount of force resisting that movement of the gun. Because of course the whole time the gun's cycling, the spring force is only increasing, and that's going to cause more resistance, more friction, so the system can slow down gently the whole way back. On an Auto 5 that is sort of tuned so that the load matches the amount of friction and the amount of spring pressure just right, you can get an Auto 5 to cycle so that the bolt doesn't bottom out on the back of the receiver. Auto 5s that are so configured are the most dreamy, pleasurable guns to shoot. People will complain about Auto 5s kicking hard, and I think this is usually a result of rings either not set up correctly, or worn out springs one way or the other in the gun, or worn out friction pieces, or just parts of the gun don't fit together correctly. When you have an Auto 5 that's set up properly, you're shooting loads that are well matched for the condition of your springs and parts and these sorts of things. There's no Beretta, there's no Benelli, there's no gas-operated shotgun, no inertia-operated shotgun, no sort of magical hijink bullshit that will be as smooth as a well-adjusted Auto 5. And I have one of the derivatives that is sort of my golden child for how incredibly smooth it is. And of course we'll talk about that more later in that shotgun's particular video, but all this to say that the Auto 5 does have a reputation for being harsh on recoil. And I will say that a Auto 5 that's not correctly configured, that's got worn out springs or a friction system that's not actually doing very much work, will be deeply uncomfortable to fire. However, one that is configured just right will be very smooth. So that's the friction ring system. Hopefully that sort of gives you guys sufficient detail. If you're wanting more information on how to set up your friction ring system, especially if you've got a Magnum gun, because the Magnum gun ends up adding a extra ring, an extra sort of control ring, and then an extra friction ring to get even more braking power for your 3-inch loads. Art's Gun Shop on YouTube has a guy who used to be a gunsmith for Browning, I believe is his background, but currently these days he's like the guy for Auto 5 repair, and he's got a fantastic YouTube channel that's just a wealth of knowledge. He's a very cool guy. I recommend you check out his YouTube channel. He's got more videos on how to set up your particular friction rings for your particular gun. But that's a friction ring system. I can't stress enough how cool this is, or how this system could be implemented on a lot of other guns to increase how smooth they are, right? Because instead of having all that recoil energy hit you at once like you would have with a pump action gun or with a brake action gun, that recoil energy being spread out so nicely over time is really, really cool. And that being a self-compensating system, because of course there's other like drag-based systems that you'll find in guns to sort of slow down their cycling or to reduce felt recoil. Even things like hydraulic buffers at the end of the day are trying to do this same basic thing, right? It's like drag with a hydraulic buffer, trying to smooth out that recoil impulse. This system being self-adjusting, where the faster parts are moving, the more friction there'll be, the more they slow down, the less friction there'll be, is just so unbelievably smart, I think, especially for the time this gun was being designed in, where they didn't even really understand auto-loading firearms very well, and John Browning's going to come along and design a brilliant one. Truly knocked it out of the park, to the point where gas-operated shotguns weren't ready to catch up with this for some time after their inception. Eventually they did, right, and eventually they got cheaper, but I think that has a lot more to do with the fact that the Auto 5 has a lot of shapes for a lot of its parts that just aren't compatible with computer-controlled machining. So this gun didn't get cheaper to make whenever you had computer-controlled machining. Guns that were designed around computer-controlled machining certainly did get cheaper. And that was a big part of the Auto 5's downfall. This sort of gets us through the sort of high-level stuff about the way the Auto 5 works. Of course, Maybe in later videos we'll talk about more in detail on how the internals and how the shell tendering system in this gun works. But generally, at a high level, it works more or less the same way across all of the guns we're going to talk about, with the exception, the notable exception of one of them. And we'll talk about that gun in more detail when we get to it. Otherwise, this has sort of been the Auto 5. We'll go ahead and step to our shooting segment, and then we can come back here and sort of talk about ratings and ranking system. All right, we got ourselves a beautiful day today. Shoot a couple of clays with this Auto 5 here. It's the same super lightweight aluminum receiver gun that we'd shown off previously. And the rings are still set up for heavy loads, and we'll be shooting some heavy loads, heavy trap loads through the gun. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but this gun is choked, improved, modified. If you remember I've got a video previously about chokes specifically, what they do, and then sort of testing how they work. And you can refer to that video if you're not really familiar with what chokes are, but the short story is this choke is a little bit more constrictive than you typically want for as close as we are to where the targets are being thrown from. The reason we are so close is it's difficult to have the camera set up so you can see the gun, the thrower, and the bird where it breaks all in one shot. Just sort of one of the difficulties of shotgun shooting is it's very difficult to make it easy to follow exactly what's happening unless you stand really close to the trap. I think I've got the camera set up so that you guys should be able to see most of these events for at least most of the targets. We'll sort of see how that goes and adjust accordingly in the future. But to load this thing, of course, we'd shown before you can do the Browning speed load. Just put one shell in the tube, let it go, and it throws it straight in the chamber. Go ahead and throw 2 more in the tube here. There we've got ourselves a loaded gun, and we'll go ahead, shoot a couple of birds. Should be nice and easy. Get ourselves situated here, make sure things are in frame, and have some fun. All right, they're throwing relatively low there. Ordinarily you'd want them to be a little bit higher in the air, but throwing them low this way hopefully makes it so the camera can see them a little bit better. So these aren't terribly challenging targets, but they are targets you have to get on quick. So I guess the difficulty is in that they're not going through the air very high. Okay, after being rudely interrupted by some wind, I was in the process of saying that these targets are low, and the reason we want them to be low is so it's easier for the camera to see them, and it does make them a little bit more challenging because you have to pick up on the target and shoot it quick because it doesn't have a long arc through the air that you can sort of track it on. You've just sort of got to pick it up and shoot it as quick as you can because it'll be in the ground if you wait. But we'll go ahead. We've got 2 more rounds in this gun. Another feature of the Auto 5 I would like to show off is its magazine cutoff. Not all Auto 5's derivatives have this feature, and in fact the very, very early Auto 5s themselves don't have this feature either. The way it works is by pulling on this lever, you disable the feed from the magazine, and the big advantage to that is sort of twofold. The marketing idea behind it is that if you're out on a hunt and you're hunting, you have a tag for turkeys and a tag for deer. If you've got turkey shot in the gun, you'd be able to either jack the turkey shot round out of the gun or shoot a turkey and then put in a slug for your deer and then close the bolt and then shoot a deer really quick. If in the event that like the stars aligned and you ever had both of those shots at the same time and the first shot wouldn't startle the second, who knows? But the magazine cutoff makes it so the rounds in the magazine will not automatically get fed. The other advantage there is that sometimes when you're hunting, you'll have to do what I refer to as an administrative unload, where you need to make the chamber clear, but you don't necessarily want to have to unload the whole magazine. And so, as you can imagine, right, loading the magazine takes time, and having to jack the rounds out of the magazine one at a time is actually kind of slow. So the advantage of the magazine cutoff is administrative unloading is now this. You just pull the bolt back and it's now clear. You can send the bolt forward and it's still clear. It won't pick up any rounds from the magazine until we turn the magazine back on. And to make it ready to fire, you can just drop it in like usual and then re-enable the magazine. It's a pretty handy feature, but one of those things that if you only ever do sort of clay style shooting, you won't ever need it, because in clay style shooting you put in exactly as many rounds as you're going to use beforehand and you just shoot until it's empty. So not necessarily a needed feature, but it's certainly a feature nonetheless. People may compare it, and I've seen people compare it to the forward assist on the AR-15, but I think both are actually useful. You just have to know how to use them right, otherwise they'll seem useless. Okay, so with that little discussion aside, we'll go ahead. We got 2 more rounds here to shoot. Go ahead and shoot 2 more birds, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of slow-mo footage, and then wrap up this video. Let the trap reset here. Go ahead and get our last one. And I'll start with the gun from low ready just to make it a touch more challenging. Shot right underneath it. I may have to redeem myself for that one. Okay, time for our redemption arc. I'll go ahead and try and make that shot over again. Get ourselves loaded up here with one round, and I will again start from sort of a lower ready position and then pick up the bird on its way, and hopefully not shoot straight underneath it this time. There we go, a little bit faster this time around. Anyway, there we have it. That's shooting a couple of clays with this gun. This particular gun, like I'd mentioned before, has some pretty tight friction rings, and with these heavy loads, I mean, it's just a dream to shoot. It's a relatively light gun. At the end of the video, I'll put together a spec sheet, and then I'll sort of keep a running Excel sheet of some, like, you know, basic tech data, like overall length, barrel length, weight, these sorts of things for all the various guns, just for referential purposes, because a lot of this data I couldn't find when I was trying to look up these guns, so I'll sort of put that there as a resource, and maybe link that spreadsheet in the description and update it as we go through the rest of the guns in the series. But this gun, it's relatively lightweight, especially compared to regular auto fives, right? It's like a pound lighter than usual, and it just shoots like a dream. I am infatuated with this silly thing, running heavy loads through it. We'll go ahead, get a little bit of slow-mo footage, see if we can get a slow-mo shot of breaking a bird, and then send you guys back to the sort of summary section. Back for a quick couple of conclusions here with the Auto 5. This, of course, being the first video, we won't have as much to say about these as we will for later guns, because a big part of this series will be comparison of the guns to the sort of standard, right, the Auto 5 itself. Just a couple quick words is, of course, in the description, if you go and look, there will be a link to a Google Sheets, like an Excel document. And in that Excel document, I'll be keeping track of the shotguns as I go through them, sort of to write down some like basic characteristics as far as weight and length and these sorts of things, as well as just some very basic, admittedly a little bit opinionated, feedback that I have about the guns themselves. Of course, at the time that this video goes up, that feedback is going to be limited to the guns I've talked about. But as I talk about more guns, I hope to sort of have this Excel sheet sort of get filled out so you can use this as a reference document to sort of think about comparing the different shotguns that way. And of course, eventually, I want that to culminate in being able to do like a tier list or whatever of these shotguns, but I do want to get most of them at least done before I put that together, just so I'm not going to have to rearrange them and move them from one place to another over and over again. But that said, we're back here with our super lightweight Auto 5. One thing that I did want to point out, and again, this video isn't about necessarily detailed disassembly of these guns, but when it comes to disassembling Auto 5s, there's a piece on the bottom of the bolt assembly, and it's responsible for, it's a multifunctional part. It sort of, whenever the gun's in battery, it holds the shells forward in the tube. Whenever the gun comes out of battery, it's responsible for locking the actual tilting part, the locking bolt inside of the bolt, so that the locking element inside of the bolt, that ledge in there also secures that so that it doesn't, the gun doesn't try and lock on its way forward, right? It locks it out until the bolt's all the way forward. But removing that piece typically involves driving a pin through a hole in the left side of the receiver. On some of the super lightweight guns, Browning FN just didn't put that hole in the gun at all. So disassembling these is extremely difficult as a result, and I did sort of put more comments there if you're interested in the spreadsheet. Of course, don't want to get too into it and make this a disassembly video per se, but be aware of the fact that those are the sort of comments that I want to try and capture more in the spreadsheet for now, is like the nitty-gritty stuff, relatively not so high level, but a little bit more off into the weeds. But this is our shotgun. Again, it shoots really well. I shoot well with this gun. I think especially the super lightweights are just, it's a dream of a gun. Over a pound lighter than even the well, right around a pound lighter, but over a pound lighter than the standard weight, almost a pound lighter than the regular lightweight Auto 5s. The super lightweight, I think, is a really fantastic gun. And it's a shame that they didn't get brought into the States in bigger numbers, because I would like for these to be more common, because they do shoot really, really well. You'll find some reports on the internet of people that have them crack down here on the bottom of the receiver. I believe the reason that people end up running into that is because they run heavier loads to them, or don't have the friction ring set up correctly, or they just get really high round counts, right? Because these were being made in like the 60s and 70s, and the aluminums that they were using then weren't exactly figured out from a material science perspective. So there were certainly improvements that could have been done there. It's just a shame that, well, eventually the improvements did happen, right? So just pivoting a little bit to a little bit of a deeper Auto 5 history, just because I'm passionate about the super lightweights. The early guns sort of had a crackle style finish on them, and that finish would peel off, especially in cold weather and with certain solvents. The finish would come off the receivers, and the receivers themselves were prone to embrittlement, where exposure to any sort of corrosive elements or even just water and changes in temperature would cause the receiver to crumble away. And FN changed the alloy that they were using, as well as the heat treating spec, to get them to the sort of second pattern super lightweight receiver. And people seem to be of the opinion that these receivers hold up substantially better, and they don't necessarily have the cracking problems. But again, a shame that they are not more common, more available. And so, just to completely wrap things up here, this has been the Browning Auto 5, sort of the progenitor of a long, long series of, as you'll see in later videos, a long series of auto-loading shotguns. It's difficult to sort of summarize my feelings for this. I'm, of course, deeply passionate about the Auto 5, but in my sort of journey thus far and coming across all the other long recoil guns, there's certainly things the Auto 5 could have had improved on it. Browning FN definitely could have done an Auto 5 Mark II, right? If the Auto 5 is so good, why didn't they make an Auto 5 II? I think they totally could have made an Auto 5 II, and I think companies, as we'll see later, sort of took attempts at that, and I think sometimes pulled it off. They came closer to pulling it off than they did to flopping in that regard. It may have been a sales flop, but the design and execution, whew, on some of these that we'll see later, is really, really good. But we're left then, with the Browning. Probably the most unique thing about them, the most, the thing that didn't really get captured in the other guns, is this two-piece lifter with the Browning speed load system. That is truly a stroke of genius, and when it comes to Val Browning's life and legacy, I think we can sort of point to that as being the crowning achievement. Is when it comes to loading shotguns, as I'm sure you shotgun people will be familiar, especially automatic shotguns. Typically, you'll sort of have a competition between two factors when it comes to the it's known as the carrier, but also sometimes called the lifter, the elevator. But you'll sort of have a competition of two factors where generally you can either have it one of two ways. You can make it so you can load shells without having to press a button, or you can have it so that you can get shells out of the magazine without having to push a button, right? So just by racking the bolt, you can get shells out of the magazine. If you think about something sort of like the Berettas and inertia guns that we're used to today, of course they have a button back here that gets shells out of the magazine, whereas the Auto 5 with this two-part system, if you ask me, is the best, easiest, smartest way to have a shotgun load and unload, to cycle, best manual of arms, most straightforward, most simple, least learning curve. It's incredibly intuitive from a user standpoint, and I don't think I can sing enough praise for that system itself. That all said, you don't have to have that system on an Auto 5 for it to be a great, shootable, wonderful gun. And then that said, you can retrofit the two-part systems into guns made before the two-part system existed. It really is just like a plug-and-play sort of thing. The two-part carriers do go into the previous guns. So you can switch that out if you are so inclined, but don't feel like you have to switch it out. There is a certain, there's a certain old-timey flair in having to hold down the button, right? That's the way John Browning wanted it to be, right? Is you hold down the button when you shove shells in. But for a user ergonomics standpoint, good Lord, the two-piece system, as pulled off on the Auto 5, is really, really good. And I think shotgun people who haven't experienced it should take an opportunity to experience it, because I think, in fact, there's, amongst competition shotgun shooters, right, for like a 3-gun and stuff, like speed tactical style, shotgun shooting, there's aftermarket mods to take the Berettas and Benellis and give them this sort of a system, because people, I mean, at least some people, recognize that this system is really, really good. But that's about what I have to say about that. You know, this is the Auto 5 with its friction brake, with its recoiling barrel, with its optional two-part lifter system. It's truly a magnificent shotgun. It was way, way, way ahead of its time, but it wasn't perfect. And hopefully with these later videos we'll be able to explore that dragon that multiple different companies chased in the name of perfection, right? In the name of a perfect auto-loading shotgun. I don't think any of them ever really got there, and I think if you ask me, right, these days I don't think any company's really in pursuit of that per se anymore. I think that the series of compromises, at least that I'd like to see from a shotgun, sort of abandoned the quest that I think the Auto 5 came really, really close to over 100 years ago. Anyway, I'll leave you guys there for this one, a little bit of food for thought for you, and see you in the next video where we'll have another shotgun that looks like this, but isn't this.